there's an idea that inflation causes social destabilization, and you particularly get it among hardcore libertarians, gold bugs, people like that. They say inflation causes socialism. Inflation is this majorly destabilizing force. Once you let money get out of control, everything else gets out of control. And for a long time, I thought this was just a crazy crank view. And I have come to believe that there might be something in it. So I've got Mark Koyama. He's a professor at George Mason University of Economics. I've got my colleague Pieter, who's another editor at Works in Progress, and I am Ben Southwood, an editor at Works in Progress, and I want to work out if this is true.
So I'm sort of sympathetic to your view now. I was recently in New York for the launch party of the Works in Progress print magazine, and after our launch party, I went to a bodega to have a sandwich. And next to the cash register, it said this little sign which said that because of inflation, the bodega was charging a temporary 50% levy on all prices at the bodega until prices came down again. So the basic idea here is that not just does a voter hate changes to the price level or the rate of change, they just dislike the price level being high in general. And this is at the source of the kind of deep dissatisfaction we see with politics in America and especially also politics in Europe.
So Peter's saying that Trump was elected because of inflation. What do you reckon?
Well, it's pretty plausible to me. I mean, I think we're never going to be able to disentangle all the factors which led to Donald Trump's election in November 2024. It's going to be impossible. So the thing about inflation is that it affects almost everybody. So almost everybody is going to be, buying groceries or petrol, gasoline. They're going to notice the prices going up. Whereas only a relatively small proportion of the population actually really closely follow economic news. So if the economy, the stock market, those types of things, they're not affecting the broad electorate. They're affecting a subset, and that subset who are really quite politically polarized. They already know they're going to vote, Republican or Democrat. Inflation is going to be affecting, the swing voter, the independent, the relatively, politically disengaged person. They will feel inflation. Whereas unemployment, which as an economist, we often think unemployment is in some sense much worse than inflation. From a neoclassical economics perspective, inflation shouldn't be that big a deal. It's just a nominal, it's a scaling thing. The costs of inflation in an econ textbook are just things like adjustment costs, menu costs. Whereas unemployment is scarring. There are all kinds of, concepts economists have to describe how damaging unemployment is in the long run, like hysteresis. So we should, as economists, we tend to think unemployment is much worse than moderate levels of inflation. But actually, politically, and in the eyes of most voters, inflation is much more, what's the right word, pernicious and salient.
Well, here's another, an analogy would be, they always wonder, when recessions come along, why don't we just cut everyone's wages rather than firing 14% of your firm or whatever? Why don't we just cut everyone's wages? Then we get to keep all the employees, and they'll know because their selling power in the market has gone down because there's a recession. Turns out that cutting off 14% of the employees, basically everyone gets over it in a few weeks, except for the 14%, poor guys. But cutting everyone's wages by 14% is like pure mental destruction. Everyone loses their minds. All your employees become extremely disloyal. No one ever does it. Basically never happens.
Exactly. So there's you could revert to a psychological explanation for this. We don't like this. It makes, but I think we don't need to. I think actually once you realize that both inflation, the prices going up, prices you pay going up, and your nominal salary going down, those relative changes to your purchasing power. And so, if everybody in the economy instantly took a pay cut, maybe potentially might be possible to sell it. But you're getting this pay cut, and everyone else isn't, at least not right now. And so your relative purchasing power is massively decreasing. And that's part of the story I think we're going to get into, is that it's not just about a price level of the way it's often measured, a CPI going up or down. It's much more about relative prices being distorted. That's going to kind of give us the mechanisms which explain why inflation ends up being so destabilizing.
By the way, since we talked about bodegas, and I think it's really important to get bodegas in as much as possible because, in my experience, people who live in New York are a very important part of our of people who like Works in Progress, and therefore I want to give them content that they enjoy. They're extremely interested in bodegas and any content about bodegas. It's like how journalists like films about journalism. They think it's the best kind of film. New Yorkers, their version is bodegas, but it's actually very relevant. So your 50% thing, we've just had the election of a New York mayor, and I don't think, it's not that crazy that in a an extremely like a an 80% Democrat city, they've elected like a reasonably left-wing Democrat. That's like a reasonably normal thing to happen. But it's one who wants to nationalize the bodegas or municipalize the bodegas because bodega prices are too high. It seems to me like that this is like a core little example of how when the public sees rising prices, they're willing to tolerate basically any policy program they think will make the rising prices go away.
Yeah, so the Biden era gave rise to a lot of demands for price controls, and this is just a manifestation of that. 1970s price controls, Nixon, a Republican, imposed price controls, and they were, they lead to scarcity. And economists can walk you through why price controls are a bad idea, but they garner quite a lot of support amongst the electorate. Of course, price controls don't solve a problem; they just generate more scarcity.
Of course, all this stuff you mentioned, 2024, 1970s, can be very confounded. And I think there's lots of explanations you might come to for why people feel ennui, why people feel malaise. And perhaps it'd be interesting to talk about a case of inflation or cases of inflation that we might think are totally distinct and separate from our own modern ones. One of my favorite ones, of course, is the hyperinflation of the Roman Empire, which at least one scholarly view has is like the essential manifestation of the weakness of the Principate, and in turn like becomes like it engenders this switch into this very authoritarian government, and in turn like crashes trade in the Mediterranean. And this is one view.
I stumbled upon a good paper by Koyama et al. on that question. Yeah, I stumbled upon a paper. What do you reckon, Mark?
So I should say, as I'm not an expert I'm not a Roman expert, nor am I a monetary economist, but I would say that so the inflation view, the role of inflation is actually underrated by the modern historical consensus. So modern historical consensus would not tend to that view. They would point to other factors as being destabilizing. And I think if you follow the scholarly literature, what's remarkable about what you were referring to as a Principate, the first 200 years of the Roman Empire, so roughly from Augustus to the early 3rd century, that's a relatively benign period of it's a Pax Romana, basically. So what we economic historians have added to this is a appreciation of the role markets played in kind of undergirding this Pax Romana. So this is a relatively monetized economy. People get wage salaries in silver. There's bronze coinage, there's small change. So that means that people, basically, ordinary people, are earning wages in coins, and they're spending those coins. And those coins are retaining, there's belief in the monetary system being stable. So people, even though there's a silver, the silver currency has real silver content, but bronze coins are worthless. They have no real, metallic value, but they're circulating as if they do because people believe in the system, just like, our coinage and notes do today. And similarly, there's remarkable evidence that they're financial institutions. So there's no archaeological evidence for this, right? It's hard for the historians to kind of uncover this because it's not in many of the sources. But there are bankers, there are financiers, there's stuff going on credit, there's lending for kind of investment purposes. And so there's all this economic...
Are people investing in like farm improvements, or are they like building 6-story slum tenement blocks in Rome, or what are they investing in?
I think that's part of it. I think that as I said, we know very little about this. There's letters in there's Cicero's letters to Attalus where he talks about some investments. They're investing in like overseas trade as well, so trading ventures, but definitely they're slum landlords for sure. And you hear about this, the negative side of this when you hear about the buildings collapsing.
Yeah.
But it, we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge amount of economic activity obviously going on, which was no record in the sources, but actually suggests this is a very, by pre-industrial standards. Obviously, the economy is, very poor by our standards, but it's a market economy basically. And by the early 3rd century, this Pax Romana is coming under strain. And it's coming under strain for, for many reasons. Basically, the barbarians, or people the Romans call the barbarians, the Germanic peoples, the Persians, they're basically more mobilized and more organized. And they're more the threat to the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire itself is becoming more politically unstable as they have coups and civil wars. And basically they need to pay. So this is a fiscal explanation for the inflation. They need to pay the army. The army need to be paid, and they get paid huge bonuses on the accession of an emperor. And so that leads to monetary debasement. And initially, when you do monetary debasements, basically, it's seigniorage revenue. The state gets revenue because they're clipping the coins, and the coins aren't worth as much. But as long as people believe that they're worth something,
when you say they're doing seigniorage, I always read this in these history books. Like, does the Principate have like some equivalent of like open market operations? Like, what does it actually mean to be clipping the coins? Are they pressing them in a treasury in Rome? Like, what are the actual mechanics to which the
So I don't think we know what exactly they're doing. We know the coin content is going down through several means. So there going to be like contemporary historical sources which are going to note this, and we also have the coins themselves, so we can measure the metallic content of the coins to some degree, and you can see the coins being clipped. You can print more coins, right? For the nominal value of the coin is the same. So I'm paying you like £100, but the coin, I'm paying you a coin which has a nominal value of £100, but its real value, its metallic value has gone down substantially, so I can print a lot more of it. And so that's increasing the amount of money circulating in the economy. And so this is a crucial way of understanding how inflations take off. So long as the people don't expect the inflation. So if you're coming out of, there was a little bit of seigniorage when Nero did it. And so it's not like there was zero inflation during this Pax Romana period, but it's very low as far as we can tell. So it's like, it's basically an era of monetary stability. In an era of monetary stability, you kind of like, you don't worry about inflation, basically. I mean, really the 1990s to like 2020 were pretty much a period of close to monetary stability in most of the West. So, like,
not stability by Victorian terms. A Victorian would be like, okay, we set a rule that was that was in nominal terms in 1815, and they would expect in 1910 the rule would make just like you could have all your thresholds set in nominal terms. You could have all your easements and your covenants set in nominal terms, and it will work fine. If 2% inflation, you lose it over 20 years or 30 years or so.
But Roman Empire, I think it's like someone estimated it's something like it's 0.1% a year, something like that. So there's a little bit over 200 years, but very very low.
You could explain 0.1% inflation from mining, couldn't you?
Yeah, it's fluctuating. The silver they mine is fluctuating. Even under the gold standard, you have after 1890, prices rose because of South African gold discovery. So even under the gold standard, you can have these types of. It's just the question is
some true for Spanish gold and silver as well. We see a fivefold increase in the price level in the 16th century.
Yeah. So exactly. So my point is that relative to your expectation. That what matters is the rise relative to your expectations. If all your contracts are nominal terms and you expect there to be no inflation, even what we would consider fairly modest inflation is going to be quite disruptive, especially if you're not, ordinary people are not meant to think about this. The Middle Ages or prior to the 16th century period of deflation often, or certainly not rapid inflation. So the price increase you get after those silver discoveries in Peru is also kind of seen as shocking to people. So let's go back to the Roman Empire example, right? So it's a fiscal decision to pay the soldiers more by debasing the coinage. And so that's part of this general kind of militarization of the empire. Initially, that doesn't lead to like anything close to what the inflation is modest initially. For many decades, it's modest. But as the political instability worsens, the fiscal basis of the Roman state gets worse in the mid 3rd century. This inflation then starts getting momentum and starts running away from the ability of Roman authorities to have any control over. So by the 270s and 280s, it's really pretty rapid. And again, we don't. There's not direct evidence for any of this, but to illustrate, I think it's William Harris, who's a Roman historian. He basically says there's zero evidence for any Roman financial institutions after that period. So like there's, prior to the late 3rd century, we can infer that there are banks and there's kind of like some kind of commercialized lending system. We don't know the details of it, but after 300, zilch basically. So the empire is really weak at this point. This is like the height of the 3rd century crisis. Emperors keep being toppled, they keep being killed. It's stabilized by a guy called Diocletian. And so you might know about Diocletian because he's famous for his price edict. So he fixes prices, and he basically, merchants who are accused of violating the price ceilings are like fed to the lions effectively, like they're killed in spectacular ways. We don't know how many people were guilty of these prescriptions. We know a lot about the price edict because it's actually an invaluable source. It gives us the price when he published the edict, 300 CE roughly, and so we know like the relative price of like different types of wine from this price edict. And so Roman Empire then under Constantine the Great, a few years later, they issue a gold coin, which stabilizes. He restabilizes the economy and the monetary system on a new basis. The issue with this is that it's really a gold-based economy, and there's not much evidence for now ordinary people using, say, small change or bronze coinage. So now you get, like, so for example, for soldiers, they used to get paid in coin. So you have a fully monetized economy, and like being paid in coin is good because you can spend it on whatever you like. After Diocletian and Constantine, most of the soldiers' pay is probably in kind. So it's like you get some wool, you get some grain, you get some olive oil, because it's just like too much, they can't break down these gold coins to give the soldiers regular wages, and people are much more like, relying on local credit,
personal script,
or they're not doing as much impersonal trade. And as economists, we think impersonal trade is like a key measure of kind of the sophistication of a market economy, as opposed to like just personal trade. Like me, I go to my local grocer, he knows who I am, so it's just an account. We don't need to exchange coins.
But here's the thing. You'd think, you mentioned that obviously fractional reserve banking, which is some evidence they did, disappears after the inflation in Rome. But you could just presumably charge higher nominal rates. Like there are tons of ways you could have a sophisticated banking system despite having high inflation. Presumably your response, getting ahead of it, might be something like the inflation is very unpredictable. And it's not just that they have high inflation, but that there's kind of random expropriations by the emperor depending on when he dies, when he exceeds, whether he wants to do a war, whether he wants to fend off a barbarian invasion. And so I wonder whether, and
you're saying that they could do index-linked loans or something.
Just charge high, like if inflation is very high, you charge
higher
nominal
rates. Interest rates to
exactly,
achieve
that's
the
it.
same real
like we do the
interest
same
rate.
thing. And
so I think you're totally overestimating the sophistication of the Roman economy. So I don't even think we know if it's really fractional reserve banking that we have, a banking system. Presumably, there's some evidence for some sophisticated monetary policies in the reign of Tiberius that we know of, but in general, I don't think they have. They're no ancient economists. I don't think they. It's unclear to me if they have anything like the institutional expertise to do any of these things.
It's like the if you wanted to be a really good emperor, you're like, you know what, guys, this inflation is really bad. We're going to be monetarists, and we're going to do like a 1980 style or 1981 style disinflation, where like, no, we're going to create 10% unemployment across the Roman Empire, because but we're going to restore the value of the currency. I mean, obviously, I'm being silly, but you would have had to do something that there wasn't even a theoretical way of solving. You'd had to like come up with a completely new idea.
They do recoinage, so we understand that, but the way they do it, the damage has been done in some sense. Now, I just to kind of like, I guess wrap up the Roman example. So economic historians and Roman experts, they disagree to some degree about how much of a collapse there is economically. There's some evidence in the 4th century, 5th century, in the East at least. Eastern Roman Empire is doing pretty well. So Pieter has written about this. So like, I don't want to exaggerate the collapse is complete. I think the collapse in the prosperity of a Western empire doesn't seem to recover, and there are recurrent crises. But I would say, like, in kind of, in support of this institutional theory, this theory of institutional consequences of inflation, the late Roman example, like they stop the inflation. They succeed in stopping the inflation. They do not successfully undo all of the damages it caused. And so the Roman Empire post this inflation
Political trust and legitimacy presumably are cumulative, right? Or like to some extent cumulative. So you build up this trust of the currency you get from us is trustworthy. You can even trust the valueless ones because that's like how trustworthy currency from us is. And then you debase it for a few decades. Like there isn't any evidence people continue using bronze and small denomination silver coins. Yeah. That seems to me like they just don't trust them, and it takes hundreds of years for them to get the trust back. It's like one of those things that's really hard to build up and fairly easy to throw it all out the window in a short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's precisely what I think is going on. It's very fragile. Like in some sense, the monetary economy has this inherent fragility to it, and the politicians are always tempted to to generate inflation, and you have to have this farsightedness to kind of pre-commit to institutional constraints to rein it in. And so if you think about like that's the story of 1970s and 1980s in the West. So politicians put pressure on central bankers to create inflation. They think it's a free lunch, then the costs hit them. And when they have to deflate, it's unbelievably costly. So it's the Volcker recession in the US, that's Margaret Thatcher, Geoffrey Howe, Nigel Lawson in the UK, like the 1981 recession. And so you really have to reestablish credibility at the cost of high unemployment. And then you have this period where we have in central banks are independent. They have monetary rules. So we have this period of relative price stability. I know 2% inflation.
And it goes back to one of the things you said, by the way, which is that if you expect 2% inflation, and to be clear, I'm not sure that the public in the 2% inflation era necessarily did understand that the goal was to do 2% inflation, not to try and keep price rises as low as possible, but to actively do 2%. I'm not sure that was completely understood, but it was reasonably well understood by financial markets. So then you actually can price in, if you know in 20 years that there will be 50% higher prices, then you can price in 50% higher prices. And so you don't have this contracting problem where in the 1970s you get basically all debts are just forgiven in 10 years. Like in the UK, all debts are forgiven. And all assets, or many kinds of assets are just completely gone to zero over a decade, which is obviously makes you, or you would expect, make people much less trusting in the institutions that generate those things in the future, much less likely to do the same kinds of deals that led to that happening. It's a one-off thing, right? You can do that once, but you can't just keep, it's like, one-off wealth taxes. You can't really keep doing one-off wealth taxes because once you've done it once, they know it could come again.
Exactly. Yeah. You can fool people once, but you can't. If you keep trying to fool them, then fool you. Basically,
you're cashing in the trust you previously built up.
Exactly.
Is this what explains why Britain managed to do periods of pretty strong debasement without losing trust? It's if you think for the Napoleonic Wars, of course, between 1797 and 1821, Britain severely debased the currency in order to fund its various adventures, both in the navy and especially land wars in the Peninsula and then in Europe. We don't really see, I think, this kind of loss of legitimacy. I think we associate it with a very competent and stable period in British history. Why is that? Is that because you're basically doing a one-off? Is it credibly a one-off, or is there some other thing you can do in order to So
the principle of a gold standard was you could temporarily suspend and go back. So another example of this is World War One. So Britain suspends gold and then they very painfully return to gold in 1925, and they do so precisely this argument that we have to rebuild, we have to maintain trust in our credibility of our commitment, and so even if it costs 10% unemployment, we're going to do it. This is Churchill's decision, which is criticized by Keynes. To go back to the Napoleonic period, so they do reestablish credibility. I think it's very costly. And so the 1790s to 1815 period is pretty disruptive in Britain. It's the Luddite riots. There's a lot of controls.
Is that a Peterloo massacre?
Peterloo massacre is just afterwards, but it's exactly this period because return to gold is 1821. So in a long run perspective, from zoomed out, you're right. You're totally right. But Britain is the British state. This is pre-democratic. It's oligarchic kind of. It's a constitutional monarchy run mostly by an oligarchy, and it's very they are able to credibly commit to it's ideal in some sense because you have the flexibility of inflating when you need to for a war. But you've got a credible commitment that in peacetime, we're going to do what it takes to go back to the previous kind of nominal price level. And so that's an unbelievably kind of thing, that requires particular political institutions and setup. And the British state is able to do that. I think that it could have gone differently. Had the Battle of Waterloo gone another way, there was political instability. There were costs being paid. The workers, in particular, are really being screwed by this period because, their prices are going up, but actually their wages are often not going up very much. So there were costs to this. But the British were able to do this in the Napoleonic Wars, and again after World War One, they reestablish a nominal anchor.
So let me give a piece of evidence that I find interesting in favor of what you might describe completely unfairly as a crank hardcore anti-inflationist libertarian gold bug view. So that crank hardcore anti-inflationist view says inflation causes socialism, and you get the policies they would describe as socialism, so interventionist government policies, caps on prices. I think we all agree that caps on prices are much more likely to come when there's inflation. But they want to argue like a broader range of things. So Mamdani wanted to nationalize groceries, maybe the trains getting nationalized in the UK. Could we call that related to high inflation because it had an RPI-linked cap on rail prices? Anyway, that's the claim. My piece of evidence. So the pieces of evidence that we might think of in favor of that are the times where you've seen high inflation and those kinds of policies coming in. And we've talked about some of those, and there may be more to talk about. But the piece of evidence I find most compelling is actually the exact converse. So between 1815 and 1914, you have basically zero inflation, right? 100 years, prices are exactly the same at the end. I would say an interesting thing about 1815 to 1914 is not only did the institutions like property rights being the primary one, because basically everything was just property right. That was like the institution. But the institutions, not only did they stay the same, like Parliament, property rights, the church, whatever, they actually entrenched themselves more over that period, right? Like between 1815 and 1914, in lots of respects, policy got more libertarian, right? Like you could argue, I think, maybe that changes at the beginning of the 20th century, but like the poor law becomes more stringent, and there are various other things like the corn laws get revoked. There are you could say this is evidence for like the converse thing, where if you do keep inflation low, then you can have institutional improvement from the perspective of the libertarian. What do you think?
So there's a lot there. I'm going to add some nuances to it, actually. So I recently wrote a book review of a book by Walker Hanlon called A Rise and Fall of Laissez-Faire, I think it's called. And so the high point of like, let's call it laissez-faire in Britain is really 1850, after a repeal of the Corn Laws. After that, by the 1880s, there is moved towards more governmentization. And from a hardcore libertarian perspective, these are all bad things. From a more kind of, I don't know what we want to call it, but a more mainstream kind of
abundance mindset
perspective.
Like, because a lot of stuff they're doing is like basically local and national governments doing like positive projects
and they're doing infrastructure projects, and they're like sewers,
yeah,
and they're
and this is, you think, because they have legitimacy. Well,
now that's
is that your theory?
You've added a nice point to my theory. Yeah, so this is because obviously this is because they're gaining legitimacy because of a stable currency over a long time.
So for me, the stable currency is clearly a precondition, undoubtedly a precondition.
What is the channel actually through which we think inflation is leading to bad policy, right? So one view would be people A, just don't like inflation, get mad about it, and B, the kinds of responses people demand to inflation are things like price control, basically very bad policies. And those are basically channels through which like inflation is distortionary.
By the way, I do not think that the main issue is that the best way of describing it is that people hate inflation, so there's bad policy responses. Like
there's two separate things.
No, I know. I think that that's a true thing.
Yeah.
But I think that the better way of thinking about it is like it's almost as though like the prices that we have are kind of like glasses that we see the world, and everything is in focus. If you're in equilibrium, all the prices, and if you when there is inflation, they're never all rising in the same way. So everything is basically out of focus, and like the world becomes insane for everyone. And so I think the key thing is that
prices change.
Relative prices are always like you never get a perfectly clean inflation that doesn't. In at least intermediate until you get back into equilibrium, change relative prices. Because of that, I think that the public feel like everything is like they are being stolen from in loads of different ways, and it's very confusing, and they don't understand. And like that's true. That's what happens to us as well. Like it's really hard now compared to 4 years ago to rebase your own sense of what a anchor for a reasonable price is. So that I agree that there's the negative policy response thing, but I think there's also just a deeper legitimacy thing. And I want to make a crazy claim that's an illustration, but Michael Denez, a friend of mine, made this suggestion, and I think it's like it's been in my head. I just can't. It keeps coming out, which is nuclear power. So nuclear power is like the ultimate bellwether for public trust and state legitimacy, technocratic legitimacy. The willingness for the public to say, no, I trust that. Okay, this particular decision you're making feels a bit wrong to me, but I trust that overall you're making the right decisions, and there may be some costs here, but they're going to come out in benefits here. Public had that massively in the 1940s and 50s. They're like, demolish whole neighborhoods. We trust you, government. Like, build a new technology that has an invisible and completely incomprehensible effect that's totally intangible that I'll never be able to observe in any way, unless you give me like a magic Geiger counter. But how do I even know what that means? So I think maybe that there's this trust thing. So this is the crankest bit of my theory. Inflation kicks in 1973 in the US and around the world from the first oil crisis. That is just when nuclear costs start exploding. And it's just when nuclear timelines start exploding in basically all countries at the same time, right? So, it's not there are no countries that avoid this, as far as I know, that already had a nuclear program. It happened in the US, happened in the UK, again, at the same time. Totally different systems for planning. The US was between private plants building for utilities. The UK had a centralized system. I wonder if nuclear power is like a special trust. It's only trust. All it is trust, because unlike everything else, where the government does something, at least you have some feedback mechanism. You see, like, they're building a bridge. Did it cost a lot of money? Like, is this a good bridge? Are cars falling down? You can judge it in some way yourself. Normal people can look at it and judge it. With nuclear power, you have to read an enormous amount of stuff and then take study results that other people have done on complete trust. Like, I'm never going to meet a Hiroshima survivor, so I can't tell you whether it's true that if you were 1.2 kilometers away from the blast that you suffered no ill effects, even though you had this, you know what I mean? So anyway, the broader point is, I think the legitimacy is the interesting link, not just hatred. I think that it's like the government, the most important thing the government produces, the currency, is now a lie, and so the government is less trustworthy, and so you don't give them faith to do. It's like, not that you demand bad policies per se, it's that you won't let them do powerful stuff, and they have to generate alternative authorities to give them. I have a few more things I want to ask you about, or topics I want to raise, maybe even just things I want to rant about, and then have you guys listen. But but one of them is so Weimar Germany. This is a real tier level galaxy brain type thing. The starting thing you're told in the lowest grade textbook is hyperinflation, Hitler, and then the next thing, someone who's a bit clever, they say, well, actually, the hyperinflation been fixed by 1930. Hitler comes in 1932, 1933 maybe, whatever, 2 or 3. And it's obviously that we got a massive recession and high unemployment there. Then another tier of persons say, well, barely anyone who was actually getting fired voted for Hitler. Then another tier of persons say, but the fear of the communists gets them to vote for Hitler. Anyway, I gather that you have an interesting way to cut through this and link the hyperinflation to the rise of Hitler.
I think so, yeah. So you described, I think, accurately kind of how people think about this. So hyperinflation, really, it's a decision the German government make so as not to pay reparations in 1922. It peaks in 1923. And then the Nazi Party, there's the attempted putsch. The Nazi Party are doing really badly by the late 20s. So 28, they're doing terribly. No one's voting for them. Things are going well. American money is flooding in. Everyone's in a cabaret and enjoying themselves. And then the Great Depression hits in 1929. American money is pulled out. The Chancellor, who's Chancellor Brüning in 1930, pursues very deflationary austerity policies. He's a Catholic centrist. He's Orthodox. He follows Orthodox of gold standard economic policies. So our revenue's going down, so we're going to raise taxes, we're going to cut spending, we're going to pursue austerity. And that period of high unemployment and rising fear of communism is precisely the period when the Nazis, as you say, start to get a lot of power. I think their electoral popularity peaks in 32, but it's January 33 that Hitler's invited to become chancellor because of this very bad decision by Hindenburg and von Papen and their advisors. And so exactly as you say, the more sophisticated people say, look, it's the recession, Great Depression, which causes the Nazis. And then econometricians and economic historians have looked at this question. So Chris Meisner and co-authors have a paper. And so they basically show that the areas harder hit by the austerity policies were more likely to vote Nazi. And there's also a working paper by one of those co-authors who argues that actually the hyperinflation didn't do anything, didn't cause people to vote Nazi. And his evidence for this, which is kind of it's good econometric evidence, but I'm going to talk about why I don't think it destroys the story in a second. So he creates some kind of measure of the areas in Germany which are harder hit by the hyperinflation, and they're not correlated with Nazi voting up to 33. And so the kind of consensus then amongst modern economic historians is hyperinflation, wrong, depression, austerity, yes. But at the time, so Lionel Robbins said Hitler is a child of inflation. And so what he was getting at is the idea that there were millions of middle-class Germans who had been accumulating savings, like Germany had been industrializing since the 1850s. There were millions of middle-class Germans enjoying, by the standards of the time, prosperous, stable lives, running businesses, or commercially engaged, and all their savings were destroyed by this hyperinflation. They didn't have access to saving protected assets. Those weren't available. If you were a financier, you could protect yourself from this hyperinflation, but vast majority of people couldn't. So the middle class were wiped out. I think that econometrically, there's just no way to the evidence the economic historians are presenting just doesn't undercut that thesis. No one was unaffected.
And they're still wiped out 8 years later,
yes,
right?
Yeah,
it doesn't matter that
rebuild those savings. And the measure of how intense, in some sense, it's how, maybe this part of Germany is a little bit more hard hit by the hyperinflation than this other part by the measure he has of the cost of living. But everywhere's hit by it. And so the econometrics can't really disentangle that.
1 million % or 2 million %?
I think it's trillion. It's the price level goes from what's one in something like 1 in 1913 goes up to like 1.2 million or billion or something by 1923. I might be getting it a little bit wrong, but it's the most remarkable. It's a crazy increase and it accelerates. And so no one has these savings left. The econometric evidence also, it's done at the, these are great papers. I like the papers, but they're done at these, local level, like equivalent to the county level, right? Uh-huh. So county, how hard hit is it by these policies? And then what does it vote for? It can't tell you who votes, right? We don't know who's voting. So it's completely consistent to think the middle class people who were hard hit by the hyperinflation were more likely to vote.
But also just 2 million % versus 1 million % or 2 billion % versus 1 billion %. It's still zero. Everything is still to zero.
Yeah, exactly,
it doesn't make any difference.
Exactly.
The variation there, unless you're telling me there's one part of Germany that was only hit by 10,000% inflation, the variation is not big enough to matter, I don't think, to conclude anything.
Yeah. So my view is that the story that people lost faith in the system is entirely, it's substantiated by all the qualitative evidence.
And would they have rebuilt it in 8 years? That's the...
Yeah, it's definitely not. And there's a lot of idea during the hyperinflation is there these so-called inflation kings, there are these financiers, some of them are Jewish, and they're responsible, they're seen as profiteers, basically. They're getting rich, and we're suffering. And actually, what's interesting is even the paper which debunks, claims to debunk the link between hyperinflation and Nazi voting, it finds more anti-Semitism in these areas which are harder hit by the hyperinflation.
Wonder who those guys would vote for if you...
Yeah, so there's I think the qualitative evidence and the narrative accounts that this is a precondition. There's nothing, deterministic about this. Had Hitler been a less charismatic figure, had the Social Democrats, had the Communists not decided to go after the Social Democrats, we could be, there are all kinds of counterfactuals in which the Nazis don't win. But it's impossible to think of the Nazis, I think, absent these preconditions, Versailles Treaty is one of them, but another one is the inflation caused by the war, and then the hyperinflation after the war. Clearly, it's...
and in general, correct me if I'm wrong here, but in general, my impression is that outside of the brief period where things are looking up, basically, there seems to be a floating voter block that will just go to any radical party, right? Even Hindenburg is basically from a party that in 1926 would have been considered quite a radical party, so they could have been basically the voter base was willing to go quite extreme. Yes. Even the ones who weren't voting for Hitler.
So you have the Communist Party doing very well. The national liberal parties, the liberal parties, they're the ones which are just collapsing in votes. And they're kind of there's a nationalist, but not Nazi nationalists. They're doing fairly well. And then the other two parties, the Centre Party and the Social Democrats, and what we would think about is the closest to the classical liberal party. Uh-huh. They're demolished by this period. They're not doing well during hyperinflation. They come back a bit in the mid-20s. They're demolished again in the early 30s. So yeah, even absent Hitler, you might have got a national in Austria. There's a fascist guy or quasi-fascist guy called Dollfuss. Poland becomes autocratic in this period, and that's plausibly linked to inflation as well. Obviously, Mussolini in Italy. So some illiberal regime was quite likely in early 30s Germany, or even in any point in Weimar Germany. As long as the American money got cut off, it's unlikely you'll get a stable liberal democracy. So even Brüning is ruling through decrees. They're ruling through like presidential decrees. They're not passing acts in the Reichstag.
Very interesting. Another thing that put me onto this path of thinking about inflation, taking these slightly crazy views where maybe inflation is bad, because of its downstream effects on legitimacy and stuff like that. One of the things that made me think about that is Milton Friedman says, right? He says that the ideal nominal interest rate is 0, because what you want is for people, if the interest rate is above 0, then people won't hold as much money as they otherwise would like. But if you can get the nominal interest rate to 0, then you're happy to hold as much money as, because you're not losing any interest by holding money, by holding cash. Like it's the same as holding something else. So he says, well, in order to do that, we need to have deflation. Now, I'm sure that his view was also like, well, there might be other downsides of having steady long-term deflation, but steady long-term deflation is actually compatible with overall good economic
so George
outcomes,
Selgin is the guy who's really the expert on this. So he has a book called Less Than Zero, where he argues for this type of policy. I think actually there are like costs to deflation. So
even steady long-term deflation caused by productivity
It's
improvements.
just the fact that people don't want to take wage cuts.
Yeah, basically. So I don't think it's a crazy idea. If you live in a world where this is what it's expected, then it's not a crazy idea. Because if you know this, then it's built into expectations, the wage contracts, the price contracts. We only briefly touched upon the redistributive effects of inflation and deflation. So, like, if you have inflation, then unexpected especially, but debtors do better than savers. And with deflation, savers do better than debtors. Right? And so borrowing money does become kind of more costly. But let's just to kind of restate it. Milton Friedman was like the first to say unexpected, rapid deflation is terrible. That's what happened in the 1930s. And so most economists are very anti-deflation precisely because they associate it with like the banks collapsing in 1930s America. And so like, obviously that's bad. And this is very different. It's the idea that you expect the price level to go down. So the experience of the 19th century, to my mind, it's not that great, basically, when you have a deflation. So like there's a period, basically 1870 to 1890, when there's deflation. And they call that, at the time, they called it the Great Depression, actually. And sometimes historians still call it a depression. It's not a depression. It's like there's no depression. But it's a period where money is tight, basically. And then it's relieved in the 1890s by South African gold discoveries and California, but mostly South African. And so I think because if you want some nominal adjustment, a little bit of inflation is okay in my view. I think I could be persuaded either way on this, but I'm totally happy with like an expected monetary expansion, which is like built in 1% or to 2%.
Yeah. I mean, I think expected is a very important part of the variable here.
Yeah.
Like because if you expect 2% forever, you've got that in like that 20 years is 50%.
Yeah.
That's just how it goes.
Doesn't matter if it's like supply or demand driven, right? Because presumably we could see a deflation. I mean, we've seen deflation the last 20 years in certain consumer goods, right? You can buy an extremely large TV for very little money or a MacBook Pro.
But that's a relative price change.
Or for example, imagine we saw a broad productivity increase because of AI, right?
Yeah.
Like if it's a supply driven deflationary period, does that matter in a different way?
Well, that's the argument of the book you were just talking about, is that it doesn't matter. You shouldn't allow deflations that Milton Friedman would dislike, but you should allow slow declines in prices as productivity goes up. I'm really interested in if there's like any, basically, but since the deflation being really bad in the 1930s and going, like, for example, the UK leaving the gold standard, meaning that we have the best 1930s of any country. Since all of that, no one's really considered like we should aim for a declining price level. Like no one's ever tried it, and no one tried when they came up with inflation targeting. No one said like, well, we generally get about 2% productivity growth or 1% productivity growth. Let's aim 1%. And because I would like to know, my feeling is that the story of the 1960s, the late 1960s and early 1970s, when you think you're on the Phillips curve, but it turns out that you're in the expected adjusted whatever, and there's a Nairu, and like everything has changed. Basically, that the curve can shift. Instead of having a Phillips curve, every time you shift up inflation expectations, the curve can shift. And so going to 10% inflation when you're expecting 8 gets you just the benefit of 2% inflation, not the benefit of...
and eventually no benefit at all. So this is the Lucas critique, basically. And it's as soon as it's a trade-off. Unemployment inflation is a trade-off, but as soon as you exploit it, it ceases to be a trade-off because people adapt and they update. And so you can't presume that these are fixed behavioral relationships, because actually, people have an understanding, people can adapt to what's going on, and then the benefit disappears. And so expectations are crucial. I would just add, in modern econ, there have been discussions of a price level targeting. So price level targeting is you could target a stable price level, but you could also target a slowly increasing one.
Yeah.
But that means if you have a temporary, say you have a supply shock. So this is Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine in 2022, supply, prices, oil, if you're an energy importer like the UK, energy prices go up. That's not the fault of the Bank of England. The inflation you import there is not it's not the problem. It's not due to bad policy.
Yeah.
And if you are targeting a zero rate of inflation or a low rate of inflation, your response, you're induced to then tighten monetary policy.
Let's go back to the old price level.
To go back to the old price level, but that's actually not what you should be doing. Probably you should probably be allowing adjustment to another to
in principle. But bear in mind, we have this extra other factor the Bank of England doesn't believe exists, or certainly doesn't talk about, which is that the public potential. So I've come up with an even crazier idea. So here's another crazy idea. Ever since I came up with this, when I say came up with, I mean lots of people have been arguing it. Ever since I started to think it was important, and therefore I should talk about it all the time. Another crazy idea is there are some things that often cause imported inflation shocks, right? So we get supply-side inflation shocks, the kinds that central banks around the world rightly say we want to look through. Flexible inflation targeting says that we should look through these. You might say that the banks always look through the spikes upwards, but don't look through the spikes downwards. You might accuse them of that, but put that aside for a second. They're right to look through the ones. I agree with all the standard theory. And even in my world where we're going downwards, they will be right to look through the ups and downs in that. But the public dislikes
the bodega owner.
They dislike inflation that's imported because of supply chains getting worse. They also dislike demand side, but they dislike supply side inflation too. So here's my crazy idea. Would it be worth building up stockpiles of things that we often have import shocks of, then anytime when there's a big shock, having a short export ban and flooding the market to keep the price level flat. Now, I agree that will be costly. Each time we do it, if we did an oil one, maybe it's 2.2% of GDP we have to spend just as a tax on everything to keep this going. But it might avoid these big institutional shocks, extremist parties getting in and change. Change can be good. From my perspective, I think that some of the change of the 1980s was good, but also change can be really bad.
It's quite an interventionist policy, but I would say that you want energy prices. There's a case for diversification, right? There's a case for energy security. There are all these arguments. I think I would just return to this idea of a supply shock. Actually, I misspoke a little bit. I think the correct kind of free market perspective would be that ultimately, if you were keeping monetary policy tight and targeting a stable price level or a slowly rising price level, you might initially accommodate it, but then you have to allow you're not going to expand. You don't want a permanent expansion in a money supply above onto a new trajectory, which was not what was anticipated. So actually, you want relative prices to adjust. So you might allow initial adaptation, but then you have to curtail, you have to tighten.
So basically slowly back to the old price level trajectory.
Yeah. So you might allow it initially, but then you have to, and then in the new equilibrium, energy prices are higher relative to other prices, but the overall price level is not higher. And this is a point, I mean, people who haven't fully kind of ingested kind of monetary econ always kind of don't quite get, which is ultimate. So inflation, of course, can be caused by supply shocks and demand shocks and so on, but ultimately it has to be accommodated by the monetary authority, right? If the monetary authority is we're not going to allow, we're going to kind of target this price level zero, even if energy prices just go up and up, like other prices have to come down relative to those. So they've made when they make a decision to accommodate, they're often making a decision to move on to a higher path than they previously committed to.
There's a quotation here, right? In the long run, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon.
Let's talk about a different period of historical inflation, which we briefly mentioned before, which of course in Tudor England, there is a very pronounced increase in prices. For the first time in a few hundred years.
Because of debasement.
Because debasement also, I mean, the theories are contested for why this is. You can tell me what you think is true. One view, of course, has to do with just the imports of gold and silver, which is a very, very strong collapse.
But they were doing a lot of debasement. And afterwards, they decided that debasement was the cause and that they needed to recoin.
But against debasement is the idea, of course, that we saw the same phenomenon happen across all of Europe as well.
At the same time?
Yes, because the price of silver and gold went down massively. And so, for context, roughly the prices increased fivefold in a century, so it's not necessarily very pronounced by our standards in the 70s or 80s, but it's still very pronounced by their standards. And one view is that this period is not associated with the kinds of deleterious effects of inflation you're describing. Actually, the British state continues modernizing and developing. It's relatively stable compared to, say, the century before that, or the century after that.
They were fighting constant wars against their own population, weren't they?
In the 16th century?
Yeah, Great Northern Revolt, which is 1568, which is brutal by many standards, but it's not like a mass killing.
Okay, fine.
My point being simply that I don't think we can associate...
rebellions, you're right, like Pilgrimage of Grace and so on.
I think one view is the price revolution in Tudor England isn't associated with the kinds of things you described for the Roman Empire, or the kinds of things you believe happened in the 20th century.
So they didn't change religion. They didn't.
It predates it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you mean all of the inflation was after reform?
As in, most inflation is towards the second half of the 16th century.
Okay.
And the Reformation predates it.
So it has lots of deleterious effects, but not the specific one I'm claiming that it has of lowering legitimacy. That's what you say.
Exactly. I'm saying that compared to the 15th century and compared to the 17th century, we don't.
Anton had some really good
this.
anecdotes in the Anton podcast about the because there were loads of price controls that were still going from the 1300s at this time, and so you had crazy.
Because you could be wrong, for what it's worth.
My understanding is the 1540s. So it's late in Henry's reign. He's dissolved the monasteries. He's done a reformation. These debasements are very destabilizing. And my understanding, incredibly destabilizing. There are a lot of rebellions. England is not the first order recipient of the gold and silver coming in from Spain. That's the Spanish Empire, right? And so the gold and silver coming in from the Spanish Americas, I should say. So the English debase, and it's this big debasement, and it's a big deal, but then it stops, is my understanding. And I don't think there's massive inflation after that period. In Spain, there's this, the price level is increasing. It's this, so-called price revolution. And there is, I think, pretty compelling evidence that the economy suffers. And then there's an increased incentive to become in the bureaucracy. You want to be the people. This is the same as Roman Empire. If in a
the relative value of rent seeking goes up massively in a world where basically all of the wealth of society has been coming in a few ships.
Exactly. So Maurizio Drellichman has these papers on the Spanish Empire, and basically this is very much Roman Empire as well. You want to be getting the silver and gold coins before they get you want to be getting the new gold and silver before it's gone its way into the economy and raised the general prices. So you get a relative benefit if you get the coinage earlier. And so I think I'm pretty persuaded that these are destabilizing. Now again, it's not a hard and fast thing, and each episode is different for sure. But I think the price revolution does destabilize Spain.
I have a great data point for this.
Go on.
Which is, in a census they do at the end of the 17th century, 50% of the Spanish population, adult male Spanish population, male subjects, is either some form of soldier or some form of clergy. So half of the adult male population is basically engaged in strict rent-seeking or rent-receiving activities, in large part,
That's
I
a good
imagine,
fact.
for this story.
That was a good worth of fact. Pivot. We have a great article in issue 20. It's not pivoting the topic, just a different way of looking at it. In issue 22 of Works in Progress, the next one coming out in January, and it's by Michael Hill, who works at Britain Remade, and it's about Soviet economic reforms. And so what I hadn't known is that there were loads of reformers in all eras of Soviet Union. They had equivalent little think tanks, people passing around policy papers, getting to the top, thinking their reform was going to get implemented, didn't get implemented. And And a very interesting tidbit in the piece that I don't think was the key thing he was focusing on, but it would this idea was in my head, so I'm looking at everything through the goggles of this idea. A little bit is that they always saw, and I think he has evidence that they were right to see this. They're keeping a stable price level as being like a very core part of their maintaining their legitimacy. The public would basically take anything, the depredations of living in like not a very high consumption good society, not a very free society in lots of respects, although we had some virtues compared to realistic alternatives. They were willing to accept it as long as prices didn't go up. And yes, they had prices in the Soviet Union. Like it didn't work as a kind of a gift economy. And then one of the reformers like kind of succeeded, but the system was actually way too complicated and depended on you couldn't just unleash prices. That would cause like chaos. But many of the reformers, that's what they were trying to do. They were like, we need to get price systems going. Of course, we'll do a socialist price system, but we need to get some kind of price system going. What they perhaps should have done is created like a new parallel system that everything was working on. What they did do was just like, let's let prices go. And I don't think it's that coincidental that when they achieved that, there was the collapse of the Soviet Union like really soon afterwards.
Because you did see increases in price level.
Yeah, so people actually seeing increases in the price level, and then perhaps it was like we could take anything else, but not increases in the price level. That's the one thing we can't take.
Well, Gorbachev is very naive because he thinks you can do economic reform and not have political reform. It's his a good mistake.
Isn't that China's view is accurately that you can do that?
So and you have to accompany it with political repression. So if Gorbachev had repressed, so he thought you could do this and you could not have demands for political change. And then when demands for political change happened, he was like, I don't want my guys to shoot people on the streets. And the Chinese are willing to shoot people on the streets in Tiananmen Square. I think that's it. I mean, I read a biography of Gorbachev, and this might be the biographer's view. I'm just parroting, but the biographer's view is it's super weird that the Soviet Union selected ruthless, kind of like pragmatic Machiavellian leaders. Like, obviously Stalin's the epitome. He's a psychopath, but all the others are like they're willing. Khrushchev is willing to kill whoever it takes. They actually managed to choose a guy who's like a normal human being in the sense that he's not willing to be morally culpable. He does, there are people executed on him, but he's not willing to order the soldiers to shoot people. And that biographer basically, in some sense, the fall of the Soviet Union, in some sense, the crisis it faced was preordained by the economics, by energy prices and what was happening. But like with a more authoritarian leader, maybe they could have persisted, and maybe we wouldn't have had the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1990.
A view I've come to hold is that societies are institutionally conservative. Like this is not. I'm not the progenitor of these. I think it's what Mansur Olson would also think, but also just lots of people who look into it. Societies are inherently quite stable because of the endowment effect and because you get like stakeholder groups who have a lot to lose from the system changing. And so I think that basically is the default, is for things to stay the same. That means that if you can get to a good equilibrium, then you can sustain really good institutions for a long time. You can also sustain bad ones. I think the Soviet Union had pretty bad institutions. You could sustain them. I think lots of societies, some of the ones that we've discussed, had pretty bad sometimes evil institutions, but they were able to sustain them so long as they one of the features that was necessary for sustaining them was low and stable inflation, or no inflation.
I have a good example for this, which is Adolf Hitler. So the Nazis, so even Adolf Hitler believed that inflation was one of the things, I think, which destabilized the Weimar regime. So they were obsessed about keeping inflation down. So they had price controls, actually, but they also they repressed prices, they repressed wages, precisely because they thought that was the one thing that people would lose faith in Nazism. And the Nazi economy was not this miracle economy that people think it is. Like Adam Tooze kind of convincingly demonstrates it's pretty flawed, and it's kind of like it's kind of always on the edge of collapsing. But throughout, they maintain price stability, more or less price stability until the 43 basically.
What's interesting is the four examples you've given of inflation in some way being linked or leading to just not just like a change within the political order, as we might say, happened in Britain in 1979 or in the US with Reagan as well, but actual revolution, change of the political order, have all been I think quite illiberal by our standards, right? So the Principate going to the Domitate, the Iranian regime switching for the Islamic Revolution, Soviet Union, and I think by our standards, even Weimar is a very illiberal government. So does it seem to be the case that like obviously inflation leads to like, or in general like price instability leads to like political upheaval, but somehow it seems that the countries are like worse at dealing with it.
No, it's just
happen to have like worse institutions as well.
For sure. I mean, that's just like if you have really flexible institutions, then you don't have to have a revolution to get change. That's the great thing about having like especially the English parliament style system, where you can get like a fairly small shift, complete change, and like massive power in principle to achieve that change. I have lots of opinions about whether that actually exists in practice in the modern world, but like in 1980, it did still mostly exist. I think clearly having those kind of ways you can boil the thing over to the new system is a good way, because what you have, right, is like you have a bunch of people who it's got worse and worse and worse. Like think about, I don't know, the Russia in like the 1910s, a time like an eternally lived hypothetical Russian noble should look at what he can see the future. He should look at what's going to happen, and also what happened in lots of other countries and so on, and be able to say, okay, we just need to do what Stolypin's saying, like do some moderate reforms, steady the ship. And the British system has the power to continually do that, and loads of other systems have achieved that as well. But I think the democratic systems are the best at doing that. But the Russians, like they couldn't do it. Like, no, we have to just keep protecting our privileges. In fact, entrench them like massively. You see what I mean? Like they can't make the deal. But whereas in history we see things like that could have happened to us if Parliament from the 1690s like couldn't come up with ways of building roads or like dealing with settlements or enclosing fields. Like we could have had the exact same thing, but in fact there were flexible institutions that allowed us to move more smoothly rather than having a revolution. And I worry that we've undone the flexibility of our institutions over the last 40 years, which is why we're more steadily building towards what feels like a boiling point compared to historically, in my view. But that's just like that again. I'm going off on one.
It's an interesting view, because I think people often like, you know, people who are critics of democracies, they often think that autocracies have more flexibility because, like, you know, it's just Stalin or it's just like the Shah of Iran. They can change policies. But the irony is like with very few, I'm not aware of any good exceptions. These autocracies are very bad. They're never, in principle, you know, like, yeah, the Russian Tsar Nicholas could have anticipated these policies and done the reforms, but of course he can't. The Shah in Iran should have anticipated the inflation and his bad policies, excess militarization, and his westernization was upsetting
the Ottomans. Can't touch any whack. How do you pronounce that?
Yeah, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Well, can't touch any of them ever. Like, or think about nail houses in China, right? So we think of the Chinese government as being like able to do whatever it wants. And I think increasingly it actually is getting more powers to do what it wants. But the Chinese government of the 1990s or 2000s did not have the power to do whatever it wants. Much less power. Like we can use compulsory purchase or eminent domain to demolish things we want to demolish. But in China they just couldn't. So if you said no, you just got a bunch of like they have really weak compulsory purchase.
Oh, really? It's
shocking because because the legitimacy of the state to expropriate people is very low. Whereas in Britain in 1950, the legitimacy of the state is so high, the public will suffer basically any expropriation. It's obviously for the common good. So yes, it's bad for this guy, but like we know it's going to come out in the wash. But in China in the 1990s or 2000s, no one thought that. So you can't demolish a house.
There's some kind of variable like state cohesiveness or societal cohesiveness, right? Which is when you have it, democracy functions well. And maybe if you had an autocracy, it might function relatively well potentially. But democracy works really well when you have this high level of social cohesiveness because people can make these deals. They can accept a loss on one margin for a benefit on another. And I think monetary stability is part of this cohesiveness. Like, it's a key element of this cohesiveness. But then, like, if you don't have this cohesiveness, if you just don't trust anybody else, or you know, and that could be because inflation has ruined your savings or whatever, then like I think that like both democracy and autocracy go perform very badly on multiple margins.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. If you have low, this is another hobby horse of mine, but I think that in Britain today we trying to act like we have the political legitimacy in our government of the 1950s or 1960s government. We actually don't. We've got we still got high political legitimacy compared to a developing country, But we don't have 1960s political legitimacy. The public just does not trust the government to do what the public wants the government to do.
How does this manifest? Like, in what way are they acting as if
So there are loads of different examples. Firstly, people express low trust that they're going to do what they want. Secondly,
in what way is the government acting like they do?
Oh, I see. So this relates very closely to a thing I think at the moment, a bit of hobby horse of mine, which is I think that the UK government in particular, but I think developed world governments kind of all fall into this, but the UK government in particular wants to act like it's a super high trust, super high legitimacy government, when in fact it's like medium high. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Like in the 1950s and 1960s, basically everyone accepted that the government could compulsorily purchase, so like buy, you can't say no, some land, demolish what's there, build a road, might be near your house, might be demolishing your house, and there wouldn't be big pushback on this. People would basically accept, okay, it might hurt me now, but overall the government does stuff to benefit us all, and if we let this one happen, it'll scratch someone else's back, but something else will scratch my back. Now, it's just obvious that doesn't happen. It's obvious that people won't tolerate that. People near HS2 want to try and make it as costly as possible to stop it, or delay as much as possible to stop it, or try and stop it, or bury it as much as possible, even though that costs the country, billions and billions of pounds. It's obviously not the best possible way of spending that money. And I think we should turn to mechanisms unlike compulsory purchase, which relies on trusting the government to do the right thing, to stuff like what Japan did when it had a less legitimate state in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, land readjustment, where the public who are affected, the landowners, you have to get 3/4 of them to agree, and they share the benefits. I think that's a way that's like, it's basically legitimacy proof. It works even in a really low legitimacy society. And I was talking about China. In China, this is how they get comprehensive redevelopments that don't have nail houses that are holdouts. And the other example I give is what we call in the UK hypothecation. It's called either earmarking or ring fencing in other countries, which is basically where instead of your money that you pay to the taxman, let's say, goes into the general budget, it's held for a particular priority. Now, the UK government hates this, or the Treasury hates this, because their view is that, no, we need to have complete control at any one moment, so we've got flexibility to move it from one pot to another. What if it turns out there's this new really important priority? We need to have flexibility so that we can perfectly choose. But the problem is that you might not actually get that money in the first place if the public thinks you're going to spend it on whatever they hate most, like migrant hotels or woke or whatever they don't like, the billionaires. Whatever it is the public don't like, they're not going to give you the money. And this is a key reason, in my view, why they haven't been able to raise taxes for basically anything, including investment projects, over the last 50 years. It's not really happened. And I think that, like, for example, the roads budget was raided in 1997 to go for general priorities. Before that point, roughly fuel duty that you paid in went to building new roads, which was the understanding originally. They actually broke the strict hypothecation, but the public could trust that it was roughly going to happen. Ever since then, that hasn't been true. And I think this is actually a part of people's distrust. Like in places where they didn't build roads that they've been planning for decades, there are places that really strongly go reform. And I think that there's like a mistrust of... Anyway, I think if they hypothecated, the public would let them raise money to spend on investment projects. And these are just two ways. I think there are a whole bunch of ways where we're acting like we're a super high development state. We're actually like, we're not a developing country, but we don't have the trust in and the state capacity to do the things that we could do in the past.
So this is probably like terrifically confounded, but you could say one view would be that it is trust, but presumably another view would be this is because of growth. That if you have lots of economic growth, you both have lots of surplus going around, which the state can use to compensate losers, but also you can basically trust that a shock to your like well-being now is like a very temporary one which will compensate in the future. Like I'm thinking, for example, now of Spain in the second half of the 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Where Spain is by many standards has like some pretty serious problems in terms of corruption, in terms of functional public institutions. I think people understand the state is really quite dysfunctional. I mean, of course, the story of Spanish urban development is in large part, certainly in coastal areas, has to do with basically violating the coastal law, which prevents you from building too close to beaches. And so basically, core to development in Spain is corruption and law breaking. But despite that, I think people are like pretty comfortable with it. And my suspicion would be that it's because Spain, for a 20-year period, between say 55 and 75, maybe a 50-year period until 1970, is like the fastest growing country in in the world, and this basically gives you lubricant that allows you to like
I agree with that.
do lots of things.
I agree that growth
Trust or
gives you
no
lubricant.
trust?
I agree that growth gives you lubricant. The amount of lubricant you need, I don't like trust as much as I like legitimacy, by the way, because I think it's specifically the state, what people believe is like what within their gift to do. And I think that changed a lot. Trust is relevant, and I'm not disagreeing with you on that. But like that, I like
Use whatever word you want to use.
Trust is correlated with interpersonal trust, which is a societal feature. I mean, the trust in government is related to that, and we have to. Yeah, I think we have to be careful.
Interpersonal trust is really high in the UK, though. I don't actually think interpersonal trust has fallen much.
So that's what I mean. They're different concepts.
Yes.
They're different concepts.
Yeah.
So but going back to inflation, right? So the idea is that inflation, in some sense, one of the most fundamental promises, implicit promises, the state makes to the public is that we're not going to mess up with this nominal anchor. Like, in some sense, you can trust us that the money will still mean something in the future. Now, mean something, I think, does give you some flexibility. It could be like, a 2% or 1% inflation. It could be zero inflation. But the public understand it. They know it. They can form expectations about the future path of prices. And I think that's like, I think it's been understood since ancient times. That's a fundamental kind of covenant that the sovereign of the state makes with the people implicitly. And when you violate that, then like you've cut, you're like putting a plank from the state.
Well, just think about another analogy here. By the way, I think the way you're putting it there is exactly the way I think about it. But here's another analogy. What's the other most fundamental thing that a state has to do? Easy. Defend you from foreign invaders. Like that is the number one is defend you from foreign invaders.
Exactly.
You're actually even allowed to give us crappy money
in exchange for defending.
If you defend us for foreign invasions, then the second thing you do is give us usable money. Now, what is the like number one thing that causes total societal change, collapse, government collapse? Is like losing a war. You lose a war, you go mental. Like the French in the 1870s, like you just go mental. Like everything goes crazy when a country loses a war, and the government always gets blamed because it's in fact their fault. I think that if we believe that, then we're basically forced to believe the inflation story must be part true. Yeah. Because by analogy, it's like it's the second thing they do. They do one, they do two. Like,
and the two are connected. So the Weimar inflation is because they lose the war, right? Whereas had UK, had Britain and France lost World War One, like in some different scenarios could play out, but you can imagine the Germans impose a huge reparations bill on them. Now, the British have their empire, maybe they have enough money to pay it, who knows? But but the French don't. They would hyperinflate, and then they would have like the conditions. And many people think there's no a priori reason why, like the Germans are not, the modern view at least is the Germans are not uniquely prone to Nazism and fascism. Some sense, like the French had Action Française, they had fascists, right? So the French could have gone fascist had they lost World War One. I think that's totally plausible.
Yeah, they kind of de facto went fascist when they lost the Franco-Prussian War, right? Like there were a lot of people who were leaning in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, they use repression against there's we go communists as well, right? There's there's the commune in France. There's political violence. So there's so clearly that's the case. I think in the post World War One period, the conditions are there for like fascism because of social Darwinism and so on. Yeah, so
it seems though that there are some societies that basically build up a tolerance for this, for like very unstable price levels. I think there's a famous paper where they basically survey people. They ask voters in 3 countries, in Germany, the US, and Brazil, why they dislike inflation so much. And the first question, actually, before you ask them why they dislike it, they ask them, like, how bad do you think this is? And the question is phrased as, high inflation leads to political instability and violence. And the Americans agree with, I think it's 84%. They are just massive agreement that inflation is a terrible thing. Germans, this is in the 1980s, by the way, so Germans have a slightly different historical memory. Germans agree, roughly 80% agree, and then some more somewhat agree, and basically a huge majority as well. But Brazil, the third country polled, only 44% of the population agrees that inflation is likely to lead to political instability and violence. Now, this is in a period where Brazil's had a very strong history of high inflation. It, of course, is a country which has some of the problems you described. It's not necessarily a country which has seen, at this point, big revolutions. You can find other similar examples in South America, where clearly, of course, when we see very, very high inflation, say like with Fernandez recently switching to Milei, where indeed people get angry and they do revolution. But in general, in South America,
expectations clearly matter a lot. I think though that, so I'm not certain of this, but let me propose an idea. I think we live in one of the most price increase tolerant societies that ever existed in the world.
Like you in Britain here today?
I think modern Westerners live in extremely tolerant of price increases. And that is a general like trust in the system function, right? Like high trust means that you will tolerate some prices going up sometimes, right? Like the more you trust that individual high prices that feel like ripoffs to you aren't an indication that your life is about to be immiserated, the more you're willing to tolerate those individual ones. Okay. Now, separately, the overall rate of inflation, can you tolerate different levels? I think that if you expect 10% inflation, but they actually keep to 10% inflation, then yes, it does have downsides compared to if it were 2% inflation, but the expectations is by far the most important.
They're holding dollars. For rich people, are holding dollars. And I mean, Brazil, for me, Brazil supports the theory in some sense, right? You can't have a stable, functioning society with high inflation, and Brazil supports that. I mean, I think the survey evidence, in some sense, not conclusive either way. I think you've got to look at like what's the overall picture, and like Brazil's had high inflation, it's had political instability. They have, when one party loses, they persecute the other party.
Certainly, based on the potential that people thought for Brazil in like the 1960s,
exactly.
It's like one of the most dramatically underperformed countries from where people thought like, oh, this is the future. Like this is like super cool country leading loads of different fields, and now people don't think that.
So I don't think so to reiterate, like the way I think about it, at least, it's not that inflation it's not one-to-one monocausal inflation revolution, right? Because of you could elect a leader democratically who's committed to solving this problem, like Reagan Volcker in the US, Thatcher in the UK. You could it could be that like the dysfunctional is the dysfunction stops short of revolution. So maybe that's Brazil in some periods. So you can have you just have dysfunction and people muddle through, but it's still not good, right? So it's like it's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition.
I think that what we've come to the conclusion is that my gut theory and potted papier-mâché story that I made up and like tried to do motivated reasoning to find the best confirmation bias of my theory is turned out to be all true. We had an expert on. He's told me that all of my confirmation bias was true. Pieter, you tried to knock me down, but failed. You failed comprehensively, and everyone agrees. Every listener will agree that we have proven that inflation is dangerous. So thank you very much. Obviously, I'm joking a bit. Thank you very much for coming on, Mark, and good to chat, Pieter.